It is January 1944, somewhere near Augsburg, Germany. Frost clings to the wings of a tired Messerschmitt Bf 109. Mechanics work in silence, their breath visible in the cold morning air. The airfield is quiet, too quiet for a nation once confident of victory. Overhead, the distant hum begins. Faint at first, then building into a deep rolling thunder. The ground trembles. The German crew looks up. Across the horizon, hundreds of dark silhouettes cut through the clouds. B-17 flying fortresses, B-24 Liberators, and the nimble P-51 Mustangs that now escort them all the way to their targets. The sky once ruled by the Luftwaffe now belongs to another power. A power that Germany once mocked as lazy and unprepared. In 1939, German generals laughed at the thought of American factories building a war machine. By 1944, those same factories were producing 100,000 planes a year, and sending them across the Atlantic like a storm that never ended. The question is, how did it happen? In the late 1930s, the world was holding its breath. Europe was rearming. Germany's factories pulsed with energy, their furnaces glowing through the night. Adolf Hitler's vision of a mechanized empire was taking shape, one built on speed, steel, and fear. By 1939, the Luftwaffe was the pride of Nazi Germany. Sleek fighters, precision bombers, and air crews trained under an ideology of superiority. Germany believed it had mastered modern war, fast, efficient, unstoppable. Across the Atlantic, things looked very different. The United States was still crawling out of the Great Depression. Assembly lines that once produced cars and radios were quiet. Military budgets were minimal, training facilities outdated, and many Americans wanted nothing to do with another European war. In Berlin, Nazi intelligence analysts studied U.S. production reports. They saw factories running below capacity, a population weary of foreign entanglements, and a Congress resistant to military spending. In the Reich's war rooms, it became a point of confidence, even mockery. To them, America was a land of consumers, not soldiers, a place of jazz clubs and assembly lines for toasters, not tanks. When Hitler spoke to his inner circle, he dismissed American capability outright. The Americans are good at making cars and refrigerators, but not for war. And for a time, the evidence seemed to agree. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939 and France in 1940, the world watched in disbelief. Blitzkrieg shattered the old order. While Britain fought for survival, America remained a spectator, neutral, divided, and slow to react. President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood this fragility. He knew that without preparation, the United States could never meet the scale of what was coming. But the public mood was isolationist. Congress refused to rearm fully. The Army ranked 17th in the world, behind even Portugal. Yet beneath the surface, something was shifting. In Detroit, Chicago, and Seattle, engineers still talked about innovation even in peacetime. The American industrial base, though dormant, remained vast, disciplined, and flexible. The technology for mass production already existed. It merely needed a purpose. Meanwhile, German confidence bordered on arrogance. Their early victories had created an illusion of invincibility. Propaganda films celebrated the speed of panzers, the precision of dive bombers, and the genius of German engineering. To the Nazi leadership, war was a contest of ideology and will, not of production volume. They believed that quality would always defeat quantity, but war, as history would show, is rarely that simple. By 1940, the Luftwaffe had lost hundreds of planes over Britain. Each aircraft took months to build and specialized craftsmen to assemble. Replacement parts were scarce and production lines couldn't keep pace with losses. In contrast, American car companies were still producing millions of vehicles a year. They had perfected the art of interchangeable parts, standardized processes, and fast assembly. If those factories ever turned to war, the numbers could become unimaginable. A handful of German officers understood this risk. Intelligence reports arriving from Washington warned that if America mobilized, its industrial base could dwarf that of the entire Axis combined. But these warnings were dismissed in Berlin as defeatist talk. For now, Germany still ruled the skies. By late 1940, the Luftwaffe had over 4,000 operational aircraft, a formidable arsenal by any standard. The factories of Messerschmitt, Heinkel, and Junkers ran day and night, churning out machines for the next offensive. The idea that America, distant, unarmed, and inward-looking, and could ever compete seemed absurd. But just as German planners celebrated their early victories, the first tremors of change were already being felt across the Atlantic. Roosevelt's speeches began to shift in tone. The arsenal of democracy was not yet a reality, but its promise had been spoken aloud. And soon the sleeping giant would wake, not with speeches but with machines. On December 7, 1941, the calm of a Sunday morning shattered beneath the whine of Japanese aircraft. Pearl Harbor burned and America's isolation ended in smoke. Within hours, the nation that Germany had mocked as soft and complacent became something else entirely. A country united by fury, purpose, and industrial resolve. Factories that had once built Buicks and washing machines now answered a different call. Roosevelt's address to Congress, the Day of Infamy speech, did more than declare war. It ignited a transformation so vast that no nation in history had ever attempted anything like it. Roosevelt and his advisors knew that victory would depend not just on soldiers, but on steel, oil, aluminum, and the relentless rhythm of assembly lines. In January 1942, the War Production Board, WPB, was created to coordinate the massive retooling of American industry. Civilian manufacturing was abruptly halted. No new cars, no refrigerators, no toys. Every ounce of effort would now serve the war. The challenge was staggering. America had never built heavy bombers at such scale. Factories lacked the tooling, the training, and the experience. Raw materials were rationed. Logistics networks strained. But something deeper, something cultural, began to move. Henry Ford, the pioneer of mass production, had long dreamed of applying his methods to aviation. The government called on Ford Motor Company to build bombers, and thus the Willow Run plant in Michigan was born. It became the largest factory under a single roof in the world, a mile long, capable of producing a B-24 Liberator every hour. When construction began, skeptics laughed. Even the Army Air Forces doubted it was possible. But Ford engineers, led by Charles Sorensen, refused to back down. They mapped out an aircraft production line like an automobile assembly track, a radical idea for 1942. Meanwhile, across the country, the same miracle unfolded in parallel. In Seattle, Boeing expanded its facilities to produce the B-17 Flying Fortress and later the B-29 Superfortress. In California, Douglas and Lockheed worked around the clock, floodlights illuminating factory windows even through the night. In Long Beach, the sound of riveting echoed across the bay, a new kind of music, the anthem of industrial war. The workforce exploded. Millions of men enlisted, leaving a vacuum in the factories. That void was filled by women, machinists, welders, and riveters who would become cultural icons of resilience. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just propaganda, it was reality. By 1943, 1 in every 3 American factory workers was a woman. The war had redrawn the social map as dramatically as it had redrawn the industrial one. The War Production Board introduced new systems of coordination, assigning priorities, allocating resources, and preventing overlap. Competition between companies was discouraged. Cooperation was enforced. Rival corporations shared patents, designs, and production techniques for the greater cause. A new language emerged: efficiency, streamlining, output per man-hour. Every part of the American machine, from Detroit to Dallas, learned to move as one organism. But transformation came with growing pains. In the first year, mistakes were common. Factories misread blueprints, engines overheated, and parts failed under stress. Yet the pace of learning was unmatched. Every setback became a lesson. Every hour lost fueled greater precision. And as production stabilized, the numbers began to rise, not linearly but exponentially. Aircraft output doubled, then tripled. Shipyards launched destroyers faster than the enemy could sink them. By late 1943, American industry was producing more planes in a month than Germany could in half a year. What astonished foreign observers most was not just scale but adaptability. The same assembly lines that built tanks one week could switch to aircraft engines the next. American industry had become fluid, able to shift, absorb, and expand at will. Even German intelligence, which had once dismissed such potential, now reported with unease. By early 1944, the Luftwaffe command began receiving grim data. The Allies had an endless supply of replacements, while German aircraft production struggled against Allied bombing and material shortages. The tide was turning, not yet on the battlefield but in the factories. From the molten heat of furnaces to the endless clatter of rivet guns, The rhythm of American power was now unmistakable. The arsenal of democracy was no longer a promise. It was a living, roaring machine. And as 1943 turned to 1944, its output would begin to flood the skies over Europe. At the heart of America's wartime miracle was a single unifying idea: mass production as a weapon. Factories no longer existed merely to manufacture. They existed to multiply. Every component, every bolt, every worker was part of a system designed not for elegance but for volume. By 1942, Detroit, once known as the Motor City, had transformed into the arsenal of democracy. The auto giants that had once competed for consumers now served under a single flag of efficiency. Ford produced bombers. General Motors built tanks and aircraft engines. Chrysler assembled anti-aircraft guns. The government called it conversion. But it was more than that. It was industrial metamorphosis. Assembly lines once tuned for chrome and comfort were stripped bare and rebuilt for steel and survival. Civilian production vanished overnight. No new cars rolled off American lines between 1942 and 1945. Instead, the hum of machinery produced endless streams of war materiel: jeeps, half-tracks, machine guns, and airplanes that would define modern warfare. The scale was unprecedented. Between 1940 and 1945, U.S. factories built 300,000 aircraft, 88,000 tanks, and 6 million military trucks. But this wasn't just about numbers, and it was about philosophy. The American system had mastered something Germany could not: the assembly line's adaptability. German industry prized craftsmanship, precision tools, hand-fitted parts, and small production runs. Their aircraft were technical marvels but slow to build. American industry thrived on interchangeability, the ability to replace, repair, and replicate endlessly. Every B-17 that took off over Europe carried within it the triumph of this system. Parts forged in Michigan, wiring from Ohio, instruments from New York, aluminum skin from California, all perfectly fitting together without ever having met. This was more than production. It was industrial orchestration. And as the rhythm quickened, so too did the resolve of the people behind it. In every war, soldiers are remembered for bravery. But in this one, there was another army. Invisible, tireless, and no less heroic. They were the men and women of the American home front. By 1943, over 60 million civilians were engaged in wartime labor, building planes, ships, and ammunition. In the vast factories of Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed, production lines stretched for miles. The air was thick with the clang of tools, the hiss of welding torches, the rhythm of rivet guns. But for every noise there was a face. In Detroit, 19-year-old women took up jobs once reserved for men, learning to operate lathes and presses with precision. In California, African-American workers entered aviation plants for the first time, overcoming prejudice to become vital parts of the industrial machine. The government launched massive training programs. Posters read, "Do the job he left behind." Hollywood joined in, promoting unity, sacrifice, and the dignity of work. The result was a transformation of identity. Factories became battlefields. Overalls became uniforms. A rivet was as important as a bullet, and a bomber as vital as a battalion. These workers faced fatigue, rationing, and endless shifts. Many endured 12-hour days, 6 or 7 days a week. But morale held steady. They believed in the cause, not only to avenge Pearl Harbor, but to prove that democracy could outbuild dictatorship. And that belief carried across every assembly line, every production yard, every night shift under fluorescent light. Each B-24 rolling off the Willow Run line carried a piece of that faith, that human effort could overwhelm tyranny. While industry and labor provided muscle, technology provided precision. The war accelerated innovation at a pace unseen in human history. Engineers learned to design faster, test quicker, and adapt instantly. Problems that once required years were solved in months, sometimes in weeks. The aerodynamics of flight advanced dramatically. The B-29 Superfortress, for example, was a marvel of design. Pressurized, long-range, and capable of striking Japan from the Mariana Islands. Production science evolved too. Henry J. Kaiser's shipyards introduced modular construction, assembling sections of ships separately, then welding them together like puzzle pieces. A process that once took months was reduced to days. In 1943, one Liberty ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, was completed in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. Automation began to emerge. Conveyor belts, pneumatic tools, and standardized templates replaced manual craftsmanship. Engineers like Charles Sorensen and William Knudsen reimagined production as a continuous flow, not a sequence of isolated tasks. Every advancement was measured not in invention, but in time saved. For every minute shaved from an assembly line, another machine could join the war. And time, as the war dragged on, became America's deadliest weapon. By 1944, U.S. aircraft factories were producing one plane every 5 minutes. In the skies over Germany, that rhythm could be seen and heard. The once feared Luftwaffe now faced swarms, endless waves of American bombers, each one a symbol of industrial velocity. The lesson was simple but devastating. In modern war, innovation wasn't only about superior design, it was about how fast you could build it. From drawing boards to runways, America had mastered that speed. The human, industrial, and technological gears had now locked perfectly together, a system both unstoppable and self-sustaining. But behind this vast engine of production stood those who made the impossible decisions, men whose leadership defined the tempo of the arsenal of democracy. Every revolution has its architects, and America's industrial awakening was no exception. It was not a single decision, but the coordination of thousands, led by a few men who understood that the war would be won not by armies, but by factories. At the top stood Franklin D. Roosevelt, calm yet relentless. He foresaw, even before Pearl Harbor, that America's survival would depend on production. His speeches spoke not only of courage but of capacity, of what the United States could build. In May 1940, he challenged American manufacturers with an impossible goal: 50,000 aircraft a year. To many it was fantasy, but Roosevelt's genius was psychological. He knew that by setting the target beyond reach, he would force an entire nation to stretch its limits. To make it real, he surrounded himself with industrial minds who could execute. Among them was William S. Knudsen, president of General Motors, a man who understood assembly lines like a general understands divisions. Roosevelt appointed him as the director of the newly formed Office of Production Management in 1940. Knudsen left behind his corporate comfort to face the chaos of wartime planning. He recruited engineers, coordinated suppliers, and taught Washington how to think like Detroit. Alongside him was Henry J. Kaiser, a shipbuilder who transformed the art of construction into a science of replication. Kaiser's methods broke records. His shipyards on the West Coast could launch a new Liberty ship every few days. There was also Donald Nelson, head of the War Production Board, whose logistical mastery turned millions of contracts into a single synchronized network. They were not soldiers, yet their battlefield was no less demanding. Deadlines replaced front lines, efficiency replaced heroism, and Roosevelt, watching from the White House, understood that this silent war of production would determine the fate of nations. He called it simply the Battle of the Factories. Across the Atlantic, the first reports from American production figures were met with open ridicule. In early 1942, Luftwaffe intelligence briefings suggested that American output would soon surpass all Axis production combined. Hermann Goering laughed. He told his officers, "They build cars, not aircraft. The Americans will drown in their own paperwork before a single bomber reaches Berlin." But by late 1943, laughter had turned into unease. German reconnaissance flights over British airfields revealed endless rows of Allied bombers, each marked "Made in USA." The skies above England had become staging grounds for an industrial juggernaut. German intelligence tried to verify the impossible numbers coming from Washington: tens of thousands of planes per year. It didn't seem real, yet every day the sky proved otherwise. Factories in Germany worked day and night to keep up, but they faced an impossible equation. Every Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf required skilled labor, specialized materials, and precision tooling. Meanwhile, American factories were producing aircraft with semi-skilled workers, mass templates, and interchangeable components. The difference wasn't just technological, it was systemic. In Germany, production was scattered, decentralized, and often interrupted by Allied bombing. In America, production was concentrated, protected, and constantly expanding. By 1944, Luftwaffe Command began to grasp the scale of disaster. For every plane they lost, America built 20. One internal report, discovered after the war, described it with chilling clarity. "The enemy's factories do not sleep. His losses are irrelevant, for he can replace them faster than we can count." Morale within the Luftwaffe began to crumble. Veteran pilots returned from missions shaken not by the enemy's skill, but by their sheer numbers. The sky itself seemed infinite with American planes, an endless storm that no strategy could outfly. Germany's early arrogance had collapsed into silent dread, and by the time they realized the true scope of the American machine, it was already too late. While machines defined the war's outcome, the moral force behind them defined its meaning. For the first time in modern history, an entire democracy had mobilized as one, not through fear, not through propaganda alone, but through a shared conviction that freedom itself depended on their labor. Factories became temples of purpose. Churches organized scrap drives. Schools collected rubber and aluminum. Children practiced blackout drills while their parents worked night shifts. Every gesture, no matter how small, fed into the vast current of production. Hollywood lent its voice. Films like Victory Through, Air Power, and Why We Fight turned abstract statistics into living symbols of determination. The message was simple. Every rivet, every bolt, every crate mattered. The unity wasn't perfect. Racial segregation persisted. Women were still underpaid, and strikes occasionally flared. But for the first time, America's strength transcended its divisions. The moral contrast with Nazi Germany became striking. While the Reich enforced labor through coercion and fear, the United States inspired it through belief. German factories relied increasingly on slave labor from occupied territories. American factories ran on volunteerism, pride, and shared sacrifice. It was this moral momentum, the idea that production itself was an act of defiance, that gave America's industrial war a human soul. Every shipment that left a port, every bomber that crossed the Atlantic, carried not only weapons, but a message. Freedom could build faster than tyranny could destroy. By 1944, that message filled the skies. Thousands of American aircraft took off from England, blotting out the sun over Europe. To the German people below, it must have seemed as though the very air had turned against them. The age of mockery was over. The age of industrial war and American dominance had arrived. The storm was now in full motion. But its peak, the moment when production met purpose on the battlefield, was still to come. That moment would change not only the war, but the very definition of power itself. By 1943, the American industrial machine had reached its rhythm, a living organism of metal, motion, and manpower. The arsenal of democracy was no longer an idea. It was a force measured in thunder. Across the Atlantic, Britain became the forward base of this vast industrial tide. Dozens of new airfields spread across the English countryside like veins, each one hosting fleets of bombers that seemed to multiply every week. From their hangars rolled the B-17 Flying Fortress, the B-24 Liberator, and soon the sleek P-51 Mustang, whose arrival would change everything. Every one of them carried the story of a nation transformed, a machine built by farmers, housewives, students, and engineers who had never seen the front but were shaping its fate from half a world away. The battle of production meets the battle of the skies. In early 1943, the U.S. Army Air Forces began sustained strategic bombing campaigns against Nazi Germany. Their targets were not soldiers, but factories. Synthetic fuel plants, ball-bearing works, aircraft factories, rail lines, the arteries of the Reich. The philosophy was clear. If Germany had built its war machine through production, then production itself must be destroyed. But to reach those targets, the bombers had to cross hundreds of miles of hostile airspace. The Luftwaffe still possessed veteran pilots and formidable interceptors like the Bf-109 and FW-190. Every mission became a test of endurance, a collision between American quantity and German experience. At first, the losses were heavy. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg raids in August 1943 cost the U.S. 8th Air Force hundreds of men and planes. The skies above Germany became killing grounds of aluminum and flame. But even as losses mounted, American production never faltered. Factories back home simply built more. For every bomber destroyed, another was already taking shape at Willow Run or Seattle. By the winter of 1943, the pattern had become terrifyingly clear to German intelligence. The Allies were not running out. They were accelerating. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang. Then came the aircraft that symbolized the fusion of engineering and industrial genius, the P-51 Mustang. Developed in record time by North American Aviation, the Mustang was originally designed for Britain, but its performance transformed when fitted with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. The result was astonishing: speed, altitude, and range that redefined air combat. The Mustang could escort bombers deep into German territory, all the way to Berlin and back. For the first time, the bombers were no longer alone. In the early months of 1944, the skies over Europe changed character. Luftwaffe pilots, who once attacked unescorted formations, now found themselves hunted. The Mustangs appeared suddenly, diving from the sun, striking with precision and vanishing into the clouds. German ace Adolf Galland later admitted, "We knew then that the war in the air was lost. The combination of endless production and superior design had broken the Luftwaffe's spine." Factories that never slept back in America, the war economy functioned like a perpetual motion machine. At any given hour, somewhere across the country, furnaces roared, presses hammered, and trains rolled toward the coasts laden with equipment. No factory ever truly slept. Willow Run alone employed over 40,000 workers, operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The plant's layout was so vast that finished aircraft had to taxi across the state line between the assembly and testing grounds. In California, Douglas Aircraft's Santa Monica facility produced a new bomber every 2 hours. In Kansas, Boeing's Wichita plant rolled out the 5,000th B-29 Superfortress. Each machine represented the distilled energy of an industrial ecosystem: raw materials mined in Montana, smelted in Pittsburgh, molded in Chicago, and assembled in Michigan. The logistics were staggering. 25,000 subcontractors contributed to aircraft production. 5 million parts were required for each bomber, and every component had to arrive on time, precisely labeled, ready to fit. Yet the system worked with near-perfect coordination. Trains, ships, and convoys moved in synchronized rhythm, an industrial ballet directed by planners who thought in tons, miles, and hours. By 1944, the United States was producing nearly 8,000 aircraft per month, a figure so immense that even Allied commanders struggled to comprehend it. The effect was cumulative. Every factory hour meant another squadron. Every shipload of aluminum meant another bombing raid. Production itself had become a weapon of mass momentum. The psychological shift. The change wasn't only mechanical, it was psychological. Germany, once the aggressor, now lived under constant bombardment. Entire cities disappeared beneath waves of B-17s. The roar of engines replaced the sound of victory speeches. German civilians took shelter in basements as the air trembled with explosions. For them, the war had turned upside down. The enemy now commanded the skies with numbers that defied imagination. Hitler raged at his ministers, demanding miracles from exhausted factories. Goering promised new secret weapons, but the production lines were crippled by Allied bombing and shortages. Meanwhile, American industry only grew stronger. The more it produced, the faster it learned. By mid-1944, output had reached an almost mythic scale: 96,000 planes in a single year. What had begun as an insult, the lazy Americans, had become the Reich's nightmare. And as thousands of bombers thundered toward Berlin, one truth became impossible to deny. The war's outcome was no longer being decided in the trenches or the skies. It was being decided on the factory floor. The sky over Europe had changed color. It was no longer blue nor gray, but metallic, filled with the reflections of a million rivets gleaming in the sunlight. The next chapter of this storm would determine not just the destruction of the Luftwaffe, but the collapse of Germany's entire industrial heart. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe was in crisis. Once the pride of the Reich, its squadrons were stretched thin across multiple fronts. Experienced pilots were killed faster than they could be replaced. Training programs shortened, often to mere weeks. Aircraft production, once formidable, could not keep pace with losses. Meanwhile, the Allies were in full stride. The strategic bombing campaign escalated to unprecedented intensity. Targets were no longer chosen at random. Every raid was calculated to cripple Germany's ability to sustain war. Factories, oil refineries, rail yards, and power plants were systematically dismantled from the air. The 8th Air Force alone flew over 100,000 sorties between 1943 and 1945. Each mission carried the weight of decades of industrial planning. Every bomber, every engine, every gun a product of meticulous calculation. The toll on German production. The combined bomber offensive struck with brutal efficiency. In Schweinfurt, ball-bearing factories, essential to German tanks and aircraft, were devastated. At Peenemünde, the birthplace of the V-2 rocket, attacks delayed crucial research and production. In Hamburg and Dresden, the destruction of urban industrial districts crippled supply chains, forcing rationing of fuel, steel, and aluminum. German reports grew increasingly desperate. By early 1944, the Reich Ministry of Armaments admitted, "Even under the most optimistic projections, we cannot replace lost aircraft fast enough to maintain operational strength." The contrast with the United States could not have been starker. While Germany struggled to produce a few thousand aircraft a year, America's factories were producing hundreds per day. Every German victory was temporary, every achievement overwhelmed by sheer numerical superiority. The psychological collapse of the Luftwaffe. For German pilots, the situation was terrifying. Veterans who had once dominated the skies now faced relentless waves of bombers escorted by Mustangs. Adolf Galland, a leading Luftwaffe ace, described the changing atmosphere. "We no longer encountered formations of 20 or 30 bombers. We saw hundreds. It was as though the sky itself had turned against us." Casualties mounted. New recruits were inexperienced, fearful, and unprepared for the scale of Allied attacks. Morale began to fracture, not only among air crews but within ground personnel responsible for maintenance, fuel, and logistics. The once feared Luftwaffe could no longer project power. Its own factories were under siege, its pilots overworked, its leadership scrambling. Even the vaunted German command structure could not respond in time. By the summer of 1944, Allied air supremacy was undeniable. The mass production advantage, America's ability to produce vast numbers of aircraft, created a self-reinforcing cycle. Every bomber lost was quickly replaced. Each squadron sent into combat added experience to American crews. Training programs and logistical support grew alongside output, making losses manageable. By mid-1944, the United States was producing approximately 10,000 aircraft per month. Factories operated around the clock. Workers, trained to unprecedented speed and efficiency, ensured that planes arrived on time, fully equipped and battle-ready. The impact on Germany was catastrophic. For every Messerschmitt deployed, 20 American bombers were already in the air. The Luftwaffe could intercept some, but the numbers were overwhelming. Even innovations like jet aircraft, the Me-262, could not reverse the trend. They arrived too late, too few, and in too fragmented a system to make a strategic difference. Turning the tide on the ground, the industrial supremacy was mirrored on the ground. American tanks, trucks, and artillery poured into Europe, supported by endless waves of aircraft. The Normandy landings in June 1944 showcased the full might of America's production. Landing craft, tanks, jeeps, and supply vehicles, all products of the mass production system, arrived in staggering numbers. Within days, thousands of tons of material had crossed the English Channel. German commanders were left scrambling. Armored divisions were outnumbered. Fuel shortages slowed response. Repair depots were overwhelmed. No single battle, no single tactic could offset the sheer weight of American industrial output. The sky and the factory merge. By late 1944, the convergence of industrial and operational power became undeniable. From Detroit to Seattle, the hum of assembly lines translated directly into explosions over Germany. B-17s and B-24s delivered destruction at a scale unimaginable in 1940. Mustangs and P-51s made the skies safe for bombers. Every bomb, every sortie, every drop of fuel represented the culmination of years of planning, labor, and ingenuity. The factories had become as lethal as any army. The workers, the engineers, the planners, they had turned infrastructure into weaponry. Germany's arrogance, once resting on superior tactics and craftsmanship, now faced an opponent it could not hope to outproduce. The stage was set for the final collapse, the Luftwaffe's destruction, the end of German air resistance, and the prelude to total Allied domination in the skies. The American industrial storm had reached its zenith, and the once mocked nation had reshaped the rules of modern warfare. The question no longer was if Germany would fall, but how quickly the relentless tide of production would wash over the Reich. By late 1944, the evidence of industrial imbalance was undeniable. The skies over Germany, once controlled by the Luftwaffe, now teemed with Allied bombers. Cities, factories, and rail networks bore the scars of relentless attacks. Germany's capacity to wage war was unraveling, not just through battlefield losses, but because the heart of its industrial engine had been shattered. Aircraft production tells the story in stark numbers. In 1943, the Luftwaffe produced around 19,000 aircraft. By 1944, American factories were producing more than 100,000 aircraft in a single year, a scale the Germans had never anticipated. For every plane Germany could replace, the U.S. sent 20. Logistical superiority magnified the imbalance. American trucks, jeeps, and artillery ensured that supply lines could not only reach the front, but sustain massive offensives. Germany, by contrast, suffered chronic fuel shortages, disrupted railways, and overwhelmed repair depots. Its forces were often immobilized by the absence of spare parts and materials. Strategic consequences. The effect on the battlefield was immediate. The Luftwaffe, once feared, became a defensive force reacting to overwhelming numbers rather than seizing initiative. Its sorties could not prevent the Allied strategic bombing campaign from reducing German war production to fragments. Even elite units like the JG-26 Abbeville Squadron faced impossible odds. Veterans described encountering hundreds of bombers escorted by dozens of Mustangs, a force that could not be countered with skill alone. Ground operations mirrored this imbalance. The Normandy invasion, Operation Overlord, highlighted the consequences of American industrial preparation. Landing craft, tanks, and supply columns arrived in volumes Germany could not match. Panzer divisions were forced into piecemeal counterattacks, hampered by shortages and Allied air dominance. Germany's war planners realized that no tactical adjustment could restore parity. They were fighting a force whose strength was not measured in soldiers alone, but in production capacity multiplied by strategy. Civilian and psychological impact. The destruction was not confined to military targets. Cities like Hamburg, Dresden, and Cologne became laboratories of industrial punishment. Factories, bridges, and power stations were leveled, creating immediate shortages and long-term chaos. Civilian morale suffered. Evacuations, rationing, and nightly air raid warnings became the rhythm of life. Germany, which had once mocked American production as irrelevant, now faced the reality of a nation capable of building, replacing, and expanding faster than bombs could destroy. Reports from the Reich Ministry of Armaments in early 1945 painted a grim picture. The enemy's aircraft are inexhaustible. Our ability to supply the front is failing. For the German population, the war's end was increasingly inevitable, not because of battlefield defeats alone, but because their nation's industrial foundation had been systematically dismantled. Allied momentum and global reach. The United States' industrial supremacy had ripple effects beyond Europe. Through Lend-Lease, America supplied the Soviet Union, Britain, and Free French forces with tanks, aircraft, and trucks. The Red Army, receiving T-34s, jeeps, and artillery, could sustain offensives on the Eastern Front. British Bomber Command relied on American bombers for deep strikes into German territory. The sheer scale of production allowed the Allies to operate on multiple fronts simultaneously. Where Germany could only react, the United States dictated the tempo. Every aircraft, every ton of steel, every rivet from Detroit or Seattle strengthened the coalition's position. American factories, once doubted and ridiculed, had become a force multiplier unlike any seen before in human history. Numbers speak to grasp the magnitude. 100,000 planes produced in 1944 alone. Over 2.6 million trucks and jeeps sent to global battlefields. Tens of thousands of tanks and artillery pieces deployed simultaneously on multiple fronts. Germany, facing the full scale of American industrial output, was fighting a war it could no longer sustain. Its early arrogance, mocking American capacity, had been met with a lesson measured not in ideology or courage, but in numbers, coordination, and relentless production. The tide had turned irreversibly. The Luftwaffe's diminishing strength, the destruction of German industry, and the unstoppable flow of Allied materiel set the stage for the final collapse of the Third Reich. Yet the war was not over. The full consequences of this industrial supremacy would only be realized in the decisive battles of 1945. By early 1945, Germany's industrial and military systems were unraveling. Railways clogged with wrecked trains, factories reduced to rubble, and airfields stripped bare of fuel and aircraft. The Reich's ability to sustain the war had collapsed. The Luftwaffe, once a symbol of German dominance, could no longer mount coordinated defenses. New recruits faced seasoned Allied pilots in the air, but their numbers were irrelevant. The Allies were simply too numerous, too well-equipped, and too relentless. The collapse of German resistance. In the final months of the war, German commanders faced impossible choices. Panzers could not be refueled. Fighter wings had no replacement aircraft. Supply lines were under constant Allied air attack. Even Hitler's orders for miracle weapons like the Me-262 jets or V-2 rockets were futile. There were too few, too late, and too disconnected from logistical reality. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army, supported by Lend-Lease trucks, artillery, and aircraft, advanced rapidly. On the Western Front, Allied divisions surged after Normandy, bolstered by American tanks, jeeps, and air cover. Germany's defeat was no longer just a matter of strategy. It was arithmetic. Civilian and moral consequences. The human cost was staggering. Cities that had been hubs of industrial activity were destroyed. Housing, transportation, and utilities were in ruins. Starvation and displacement became daily realities. Yet amid suffering, the contrast with America's civilian war effort could not have been more stark. In the United States, production continued unabated, feeding soldiers abroad, rebuilding allies, and maintaining a home front shielded from devastation. The war transformed social structures. Women remained in the workforce. African Americans gained new industrial opportunities, and technological innovation accelerated at unprecedented rates. The moral victory of production was as real as any battlefield triumph. Where Germany relied on coercion and fear, America relied on unity, skill, and purpose, proving that industrial capacity, paired with democratic resolve, could decisively shape the course of history. Long-term strategic consequences. The effects of American industrial supremacy were felt far beyond 1945. Allied victory secured. The constant flow of aircraft, tanks, and supplies ensured that Allied forces could sustain pressure across multiple fronts simultaneously. Germany, with its limited industrial base, could not compete, redefining modern warfare. Calgary demonstrated that victory depended not only on soldiers, strategy, or tactics, but on production capacity and logistics. Mass manufacturing became a decisive strategic weapon. Post-war global influence, America emerged as a superpower. Its factories, engineers, and infrastructure had proven that industrial might could project military and political influence worldwide. Former adversaries and allies alike looked to the United States as the benchmark of industrial and technological potential. Lessons for future conflicts. Military planners learned that speed, quantity, and the ability to sustain production often outweighed temporary tactical advantages. The war had shifted from small battles to a theater of industrial attrition. Production as history's arbiter. By the spring of 1945, the United States had effectively outbuilt the Third Reich. Germany's once feared Luftwaffe was reduced to fragments. Its panzers, tanks, and artillery could no longer hold lines. Cities lay in ruins. All of this traced back to the factories, assembly lines, and workers whose efforts had turned production into the decisive weapon of modern warfare. Every bomber, every tank, every truck reflected the culmination of planning, sacrifice, and ingenuity. Germany's mockery of American industry had ended in humiliation. A lesson written not on the battlefield alone, but in steel, aluminum, and rivets. The stage was set for the final conclusion of this story, a reflection on what industrial power, national unity, and relentless production ultimately meant for humanity and history. The story of 100,000 planes rolling off assembly lines in a single year is not just a tale of machines. It is a story of people, purpose, and the quiet power of organization. Across America, in factories, shipyards, and assembly halls, Ordinary citizens became extraordinary. Women learned to wield riveting guns. Students and retirees operated presses. Engineers and planners choreographed industrial symphonies that would echo across the skies of Europe. This was a war fought not only with bullets and bombs, but with steel, aluminum, and human ingenuity. Production itself became a weapon. The rhythm of assembly lines, the hum of machinery, and the precision of logistics shaped outcomes that no battlefield tactic alone could guarantee. For Germany, the lesson was stark. Arrogance and technical skill could not overcome numbers and coordination. The Luftwaffe, once feared across Europe, crumbled beneath the relentless surge of Allied aircraft. Entire cities and supply networks were reduced not merely by strategy, but by the unstoppable momentum of industrial power. Yet beyond victory or defeat, the story leaves a deeper reflection. Modern warfare had changed. Power was measured not only in soldiers or territory, but in the capacity to produce, sustain, and innovate on an unprecedented scale. Democracy, unity, and purpose could create a force more lethal than tyranny, more enduring than fear. In the end, the sky over Europe bore witness to a nation's resolve, a silent testament to what can be achieved when human labor, ingenuity, and determination converge. Every bomber, every tank, every riveted fuselage was more than a weapon. It was proof that preparation, belief, and perseverance could turn mockery into mastery. The war eventually ended, nations rebuilt, and history remembered the lessons. But in the roar of engines over Augsburg, over Berlin, over the skies of Europe, the truth remained clear. The arsenal of democracy had redefined what it meant to wage war, to endure, and to triumph.